her multiple lives, doing great things. She is from Detroit. She moved away to DC to get some experience that she ultimately brought back to Detroit, and she is doing a heck of a job, if I must say, and making sure that our community, especially people that often get ignored, have their voices heard. I really love, just personally, whenever she has something coming up, she always posts a Facebook post and she'll say, Detroiters, what do you think about this? And so she just kind of starts it off, approaching it from community any way that she possibly can. So now she's working with Good Jobs Now as their executive director. And I know sometimes we hear it, we think it, but we may not completely understand it. So I wanted her to have an opportunity in a forum to really explain to a lot of people in this room that we can take the good message back. So Rebecca, if you will join me up front.
Rebecca! Okay, don't walk in front of the camera.
Oh, I'm perfect. So Claire's also going to turn on the lights for me. This is I'm going to apologize in advance if this presentation is a little bit dark, but we know each other pretty well, so we'll get comfortable. So again, my name is Rebecca Thompson. I'm the executive director of Good Jobs Now. Some of you might be familiar with the predecessor version of Good Jobs Now, so I'll tell you a little bit about our evolution, and I'll talk more about some of our upcoming work. But in 2011, SEIU created Good Jobs Now to really start to have a broader conversation across the country about income inequality and wages. And this was really around the time that the sort of 1%, the 99%, this sort of movement, Occupy movement was happening across the country. And also what came out of that was, the Fight for 15. So D15 is our local affiliate of the Fight for 15 work. And so when the Fight for 15 movement started to take off, Good Jobs Now went dormant. So for a couple months, this was sort of a fledgling organization. I was brought on in the fall to not only provide some leadership for the organization, but also to sort of take the organization into the future. So you'll hear me talk a little bit about some of that evolution. It's okay, thank you. I'll use this. I'll talk a little bit about some of the evolution of the organization, but also our broader economic justice work in our fight. So one thing I do want to mention that I'll be talking about kind of throughout this presentation is that right now, well, I don't have to tell many of you, but there's a narrative around two Detroits, right? I live on the east side of Detroit over at Warren and Cashew. There's not a sit-down restaurant.
You gotta say east side.
It's on the east side.
You gotta say east side.
Very deep east side. But that's important, right? Because there are no coffee shops in my neighborhood. There are no sit-down restaurants. There's a new Coney Island, and there are a whole heck of a lot of marijuana dispensaries. But there hasn't been development in my neighborhood. Right? There are a whole lot of things I have to leave my neighborhood to access. And so what we really want to talk about is the fact that, you know, as somebody who is from this city, many of our neighbors, many of my family members have been left out of this new resurgence. So, okay, so I'm going to quickly sort of move you through a couple things. So I know that when people think about sort of the Fight for 15 or economic justice more broadly, one of the conversations that many people are more recently familiar with is the conversation around fast food workers. And so I'm going to start there because this week is the Fight for 15's National Day of Action, this Thursday. And so as a partner organization of D15, I want to make sure that many of you know about that, and I'll have the specific details later on today. But the average fast food worker is 28 years old. And so that's important because oftentimes when people think about who these workers are, they're like, oh, those are jobs for teenagers. Those are jobs for young people. Those are jobs specifically for people, that's their first job, they're not designed to be long-term, full-time jobs. And we really want to make sure that we start to change the face of who many of the low-wage workers are in Detroit. 65% of those workers are women. And so what that tells me is that those are oftentimes people who are supporting families. And so when we can lift up women in our community, we can lift up entire families. And I also just want to point out that many of these workers are workers of color. So when we talk about who is really being left out of this economic justice fight, oftentimes we're talking about entire communities of color. And lastly, so $25,000 is the average daily salary of a fast food CEO. So oftentimes people sort of pit workers against these CEOs, and quite frankly, you have people who are literally making millions and millions of dollars off the backs of low-income folks in our communities. And so knowing that it's not just fast food CEOs, what's really happening is this larger widening gap around sort of the folks at the top who are doing really, really well and the folks who are traditionally left at the bottom. So I also want to make sure that we're talking more broadly, because this isn't just about fast food workers. So when we think about who else is making less than $15 an hour, what industries come to mind?
Housekeeping.
Teachers, housekeepers,
Administrative.
healthcare workers, administrative, right?
Daycare.
Social workers, childcare workers. So while the face of low-wage workers is oftentimes fast food workers, what this conversation really is about changing that face, right? And so while, I've heard many of our partners at D15 talk about, we started with fast food workers because those were the folks at the very bottom. And we knew that if we started with those folks, if we got them a raise, everybody would get a raise, right? But I really want to make sure that we're hitting home this fact that there are a whole lot of people in our communities who are struggling. And so we're going to talk quickly about a couple of those industries. Home health care. So, this is, for me, a really important one because my dad, my grandfather, lots of folks in my family who we didn't quite have the resources to put them, we kind of actually didn't want to put them into nursing homes. Having the ability to have those folks stay in their homes and be taken care of with dignity is a really important one. So about 88.6% of home health care workers are making less than $15 an hour. Less than 11% of those folks are unionized, and we're talking over 2 million workers. So there are a whole lot of these folks, again, largely women of color, who are taking care of our loved ones and our family members, and oftentimes can't take care of themselves in the process. Retail workers, a little less than 80% of them are making less than $15 an hour. Only 5% of them have unions, and you're talking over 8.6 million workers. And so again, these are folks that are doing the jobs that we rely on. So if you went to Target and there was nobody there, right? If you went to the grocery store and there was nobody there, we'd have a problem with that. But yeah, we don't have a problem with the fact that these folks can't take care of their families. And I'm going to say, in some cases, for some folks, most importantly, the folks that take care of our babies. So childcare workers, over 85% of them are making less than $15 an hour. Many times people see these as folks that, those are babysitters. And really what we want to change is that these are folks that are providing the most critical, foundational aspects of our learning environments for our babies. So I used to work at the United Way, and one of the things that we would talk about is the importance of early childhood literacy and intervention. And those first 3 years of a baby's life are the most critical. So why is it that the folks that are taking care of those babies and teaching them, we don't value in the same way? So I want to talk quickly about sort of good jobs now and our work, because it is not just about highlighting specific industries. We want to talk about the fact that lots of folks in cities like Detroit are struggling. So we're a grassroots membership-based organization that fights for economic and social justice for low-income workers in Detroit. We wanted to be very specific about that. There are a number of organizations in Detroit that are multi-issue, that are working on a whole lot of great issues, and we just focus on economic and social justice. And I talk about social justice because there are a whole lot of issues that hit at the intersection of economic justice. So economic justice and criminal justice, economic justice and you name them, right? Economic justice really touches everything, and so we wanted to be really explicit about the fact that we are fighting for those folks and the folks who are oftentimes left behind in a lot of these conversations. So we are going to approach our work, or are approaching our work in a couple different ways. One is year-round civic engagement. So some of you know that I ran for state representative. And as soon as that election was over, and as soon as that election was over, I had to pack up my toys and go home. There is no reason that you will continue talking to people if you're a candidate. You're actually probably told not to continue talking to people. And the other thing is that candidates oftentimes come into our communities right before an election and they disappear as soon as the election. So this idea of what if we actually talk to people year round, and if we talk to them about issues, not candidates. How revolutionary could that be? That we could actually be engaging people who are oftentimes left behind. And so having experienced that firsthand, but also, I know many of you are active voters, and folks, candidates will show up at your door. I know we've got a candidate in the room, and it's such a transactional relationship. And so we want to make sure that we're actually building relationships with the folks in these communities, and that we're doing that over the long term. The second sort of pillar of this is economic justice campaigns, which you'll hear us talk about in a minute. And the idea, so very similar to the work that Rock is doing, is if we start to drill down on issues and start to take on pretty specific fights around economic justice, we can start to get some small wins. And then the last piece is leadership development and training. So quite frankly, if you say economic justice to some folks, they don't even know what the heck that is, right? Let alone what it means to run for office or to be a precinct captain or to be organizing in their neighborhood. So we also want to make sure that our folks have access to the skills and the resources and the tools to do this work in our neighborhoods. So speaking of neighborhoods, Detroit is a really large city to organize in. A lot of great work happening in Detroit, but quite frankly, we want to take a different approach to that. And so we are focusing on 2 specific Detroit City Council districts for very good reason. So Council District 7 on the west side of Detroit and Council District 3 on the east side of Detroit happen to be 2 of the hardest hit economically challenged districts in the city. So 4825, which is the zip code that I grew up in, also happens to be one of the most dangerous zip codes in America. And so when I think about why it is often so dangerous, there are very few jobs in these communities. There is very little development, if any. I know that some development has started to come into the district, but quite frankly, these are 2 neighborhoods that have really been theoretically left behind. The other thing is politically, Council District 7 is a really great example. Their city council member was elected by a margin of just 50 votes.
Take them out. Gabe Leland, take them out.
So,
Anti-CBA, just
when you
FYI.
think about who these folks are and what issues they represent, do they share our values? Are they voting in the best interest of people in community? And what if we went to those council members and said,
51 more came out.
and what if 51 more came out? And what if we said to them, council member so-and-so, we have 500 members in your district who want you to vote this way? That wouldn't be an empty threat, right? And so one of the things I've said to groups is, hey, we will work with anybody, but if you do not share our values, and you aren't fighting in the best interest of residents, we don't come for you. But what that means is that we're actually building the infrastructure to do that, so that we aren't just yelling empty threats, right? One other thing I do want to mention that's pretty important is that we are a C3 organization and we have a C4. So it allows us to do political work in a little bit of a different way than maybe some of our partners that could not do that work. So I'm going to quickly talk a little bit about something that will be rolling out in the next couple of weeks, which we're calling an Opportunity and Justice Agenda. And this really is framed around a couple of key principles. One is that we're talking about opportunity for all workers. Doesn't matter who you are, where you are. I've heard people say to me sometimes, well, you know, people just need to go back to school. Because if they go back to school, they could get a better job, right? Or they'll say, well, you know, if people would just do this. There are all these sort of litmus tests or qualifiers for what people should do for them to have access to a better life. And quite frankly, I don't think that's the American dream, right? Like really what this is about is that no matter who you are, where you come from, what your level of education is that you should be able to get a job. And if you're working full-time especially, you should be able to provide for your family. There is no reason why we have folks in our communities that are working and are literally poor and struggling. The other pillar to this will be this idea that we have to stop investing in jails and criminal justice and policing as opposed to education and job training programs and job creation programs and thinking that that's how we're going to move our communities forward. And so a perfect example of that for me is every time I drive past that unfinished Wayne County Jail project, my blood starts to boil a little bit more because we're spending anywhere between $1.2 to $1.4 million a month on an unfinished jail in a formerly bankrupt city. And so when we think about where our priorities are, that's a real clear indication that they are in the wrong places. And then lastly, it's really about targeted reinvestment. And so this idea that if we really want to move our communities forward, we have to put resources into education and job training programs and programs that actually benefit folks in our community as opposed to criminalize them and lock them away.